There are these $5 puts on ASST for 11 days out, trading at $3.50. That's a $1.50 implied share price in just 11 days.
No, absolutely. You're 100% correct. It might make some of the shareholders suffer some short-term loss.
You've got Strive trading at 262. So that's a lot of downside potential if you're a Strive shareholder today.
We're having a bear market on the Bitcoin Treasury side where a lot of companies are trading below 1 mNAV. So it's going to be very easy for bigger players to scoop them up at a discount.
Do you think that merger is going to happen, Yves? Hey there. Today on Treasury Orange, I'm talking to Yves-Andre Graf from the One Share podcast. Yves, welcome to the show. And I've got to ask you, in Michael Saylor fashion, how many chairs are you sitting on right now?
Just the one. The only
Just
one.
the one. So you're all in on the chair.
Yes, sir.
Right on. So you had a post on X yesterday that kind of made me smile, where you were talking about how we needed to stop celebrating these Bitcoin all-time highs. And right now we're at just under $125,000 per Bitcoin, US dollars. And I love that. We definitely should be celebrating the Fiat all-time lows. So how long do you think Fiat can last? And how do you think the US dollar, being the global reserve currency, will give maybe the dollar a little bit more runway than some of the weaker currencies around the globe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the Fiat can last for a long time, right? Because of all the shenanigans that we've seen over the last years. And every time somebody thinks that it's about to collapse or there's something happening, there's always a way out. I think the central banks have it quite figured it out in the meantime, that they can keep the Ponzi going for quite some time. Yeah, so this one's a tough one. I wouldn't be able to tell you. Even Michael Saylor himself usually says that the medium of exchange will remain the dollar. I don't think he believes that Bitcoin, or at least from what I heard of his different talks, he doesn't believe that Bitcoin serves as a medium of exchange. It's really for him like the digital capital, store of value. So in that aspect, I think he's right up until a certain point. So we can go for decades for sure.
But yeah, I think that's something that kind of caught a lot of Bitcoiners off guard, to hear Saylor talk about, the dollar being a medium of exchange for a long time, because a lot of Bitcoin maxis get into Bitcoin and we go down the rabbit hole and then we think hyper Bitcoinization's right around the corner. Everyone's going to use it as a store of value and then as a medium of exchange and their unit of account. So yeah, I think it's good to have people like Saylor bring in a little bit, maybe more realism to the conversation. That keeps kind of a lot of the hardcore Bitcoiners in check. And plus he's speaking a language that, Wall Street and finance people can better understand. What do you think about Saylor coming to the space? I don't know how long you've been into Bitcoin. Maybe you can give us a little bit of that background of your journey to Bitcoin, Yves. But from there, how do you think Michael Saylor coming to the space has affected how Bitcoin's kind of hitting the mainstream?
So maybe I'll start. So I've been in the space since 2019. I heard about Bitcoin before, but as you know, I'm not going to go for it. It's the usual story. You dismiss it, then you come back to it and so on. So yeah, I've been in the space since 2019 and very early got into Bitcoin. So all the altcoins and so on, I kind of skipped that phase to some extent. I did dabble a little bit, but without too much depth. So yeah, I was a Bitcoin maximalist right from 2019, basically. And not long after that, there was Michael Saylor that also came along the space. I thought it was very brave, considering that back then there was no institutional big players, or at least known big players in the Bitcoin space. I truly believe that he brings a nuanced view in the Bitcoin space, because as you can see, and it's still the case right now, I think there's still a huge debate whether Bitcoin treasuries is a good thing for the space, right? You have a lot of hardcore Bitcoiners that are still very skeptical of it. They don't trust the institutionals that are coming in, the publicly traded companies that are running this playbook. And so it's a bit controversial, obviously. And I understand why, and maybe we can get into it a bit later. But overall, I do think it's a benefit to the space. We've seen massive adoptions thanks to Saylor. Obviously, his playbook had a great evolution. So maybe his initial play with as we've seen in the 21, 22 run where he started playing with the collateralized loan with Silvergate and so on. That wasn't the way to go, right? But he did bring Bitcoin to the capital markets, right? And I think that's the really important aspect, because now suddenly you have all these equities that are backed by Bitcoin and all of those credit instruments, whether you're thinking of the older ones, the senior notes, the convertible bonds, or even now the preferreds. And all of these plays into exactly the hyper Bitcoinization at the end of the day. You need to go through it. I think what we missed is that we skipped a step. We initially thought, oh, there's going to be Bitcoin treasuries where they allocate maybe their treasury or partially their treasury to Bitcoin. But then they ended up just leverage or playing the LBE or the leverage Bitcoin entity play, which is to even leverage up the balance sheet, whether with equity or credit, and run with that.
I agree with you completely. Like it does seem like we kind of skipped that step that a lot of us probably thought we were headed to, where just more and more companies would buy Bitcoin with excess cash on their balance sheet. So yeah, it's been interesting to see the levered Bitcoin treasury be the thing that takes off first. And that, Bitcoin always surprises you. There's not an order of operations to how Bitcoin is adopted throughout the world. And I'm sure we'll continue to be surprised every year with new things. How do you feel about Michael Saylor did kind of pivot, you said, from having more securitized loans and then the convertible bonds and now the preferred equities. Personally, I'm pretty bullish on the preferred equities, but as we've seen over the, really the last 12 months, MSTR's stock, while still volatile, has been kind of flat relative to Bitcoin, trending a little bit upward. Do you think Saylor ditched the convertible bond strategy too soon, or how do you feel about that, Eve?
Maybe a little too soon. That's true on one hand, but overall, I still think at some point you had to shift, right? We saw that the convertible bonds had their limitations as well for the play. I think the evolution makes sense in the sense that you go from exactly because Saylor himself is actually discovering the playbook as he goes, and the strategy leadership is also treading on uncharted waters. So I think that the convertible bonds made sense up until a point, but then we saw that there is also some dilution aspects that you need to consider with the convertible bonds when they're being issued, because there's the whole dynamic delta hedging play from the volatility arbitrageurs that come in, and yeah, that wasn't probably the best, or that's not the best play for the common shareholders. And as you mentioned, right, MSTR has been more or less flat over the last year. I don't know if it's specifically because of it, but in general, there's been a dampening of volatility somehow. Another aspect, yeah, so the preferred equities, I'm also super bullish. I think they are not being priced in correctly according to the markets, or the markets still need to digest what came to them, because they've been, I think the first one was STRK was back in February, so it's not even been a whole year since we had those. And they're brand new securities, so it's going to take a little bit of time. And when that does, that's when we will start seeing, I think, a strategy reaping, regardless of Bitcoin's price. Additionally, so right now, Michael Saylor is aiming to get the 318 trillion market of the fixed income, right? We've seen all the Jesse Myers graph of the entire wealth of the world, and that's what he's going after. However, the 318 trillion is also, you need to have those credit instruments that need to be rated, and that's what he's going after. That's what he's looking to have done next for the preferred equities. And I think these are two aspects. So the markets need to digest what they are, start pricing them correctly, and then at the same time also have them properly rated to be able to really have the full fledged of the total addressable market that he's aiming for.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how these rating agencies do end up rating, Michael Saylor's preferred equities, because I'm of the mind that it's going to take a while for them to even wrap their minds around, what the real risk profile of strategy is. Obviously, we're pretty bullish in seeing their balance sheet collateralized by Bitcoin. But I think traditional finance rating agencies are going to have a hard time. So I think, yeah, it's going to, the digestion process will be a while for the market and even the rating agencies. I got a call this past week from a friend of mine who's a Bitcoiner, and he manages, you know, six figures as a financial advisor for a broker that's pretty large in the United States. His broker still won't let him allocate his clients to any of these MSTR preferred equities or Bitcoin, let alone Bitcoin. He was telling me he's got, I think, 20 or 25% of his assets under management are sitting in money market accounts, and he's just like, I want to get these people in stretch, because it's a game changer. You know, if you can earn, you know, those money markets are probably paying like 3% right now, maybe, if they're lucky. And you see a product like Stretch, which is offering, you know, what, 10 and a quarter percent right now. I mean, like, that's a game changer if someone's looking for fixed income or they're keeping capital on the sidelines. So there's a long way to go. I think there's a lot of institutions that really just have to digest the entire playbook. They're so risk averse that they're not going to be first movers to this opportunity. That being said, what's the landscape like where you're at, Yves, in Switzerland? Is it easy to go and buy an American Bitcoin Treasury company like Strategy?
Yeah, I think in Switzerland we're quite lucky, right? From the get go, we had very easy access to Bitcoin and altcoins and whatever you want. Really, in that sense, the population has been, or there's actually a high, at least according to the last surveys and polls I've seen, the allocation of crypto in general, not just Bitcoin, is quite high in the population in Switzerland. You can get your Bitcoin at a vending machine, if you will. So it's really quite common to get or easy to get Bitcoin. On the other hand, for Bitcoin treasuries, I think here, because you have access to Bitcoin, then there's a lot less need for the Bitcoin treasuries or equities backed by Bitcoin, if you will. And most people don't understand it, right? Because again, it's fairly new. I think people still need to digest what it is. And at least when I talk with my group of friends, and I have more of a finance background, so a lot of them are in family offices, asset management, and banks, and what you will. Very, very little understand, first of all, what Bitcoin is, and even less what Bitcoin treasuries are. So there's really not a lot of, let's say, enthusiasm, I would say, in a sense. Although I would see a case, because again, in Switzerland, we have the same issue as we have in Japan with the yields. We have very low yields. And exactly going back to your point about the STRC, I think having a fixed income instrument like this, even not even at 10%, but even at 5 or 6%, like MetaPlanet is planning to roll out in Japan, would be super beneficial to anybody. So that's something at least I am super excited to see eventually come here to Switzerland. Because another aspect for the Swiss people is we have the Swiss franc. And if you look at how the Swiss franc has fared compared to the dollar, especially over the last year, like we haven't seen all-time highs actually in Bitcoin in the Swiss franc basis. And actually that's kind of what I was alluding to a little bit also in my tweet, because I'm celebrating obviously all-time highs for the Bitcoin price in USD, but in a Swiss franc there hasn't been since January, and that's because of the strength of the Swiss franc compared to the US dollar. So having an STRC like product denominated in Swiss francs would be, I think, super beneficial for the population and also for the institution. That I think this product would be a huge success if, obviously, again, there's digestion of what it is, if it's rated, and so on. And I don't know if you heard, but there was a podcast recently with Richard Byworth, where he mentioned that they're coming up with a Swiss Bitcoin treasury. And I thought that was interesting, because I'm really looking forward to see what kind of products they come with, because potentially an STRC-like product would be super interesting for me and anybody who's interested in it.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I hadn't caught Richard's podcast about that, but super excited for your market to get something like that. I think every jurisdiction really, you know, would benefit from a product like that. It's going to help Bitcoin. It's going to help these companies that are backed by Bitcoin. And I think once you buy a product like that, at least money managers are going to take a harder look at Bitcoin, right? I think it's inevitable, and that's something we kind of have to deal with as Bitcoiners. Is people aren't all going to come to Bitcoin by going down the self custody rabbit hole, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Yes, it could for the culture of Bitcoin, it could change it, but the more people who adopt Bitcoin, I think the sooner is just going to be better for society at large. I'd like to talk in a little bit about some of the other Bitcoin treasury companies like Strive and Semler and their M&A deal that was coming up. Before we get into that, Eve, how do you think about Bitcoin's cycle this time around? Obviously, we all know kind of the meme about the 4-year cycle, and whether it's been by chance or whether it has been based on the halving or global liquidity in general, that's something that I think had some merit. I think the market structure is really different. We're seeing, kind of global liquidity opening back up. I think economic policy here in the US is going to really rip in the next year, just because of the administration wants to see basically everything go on fire into the upcoming elections that we have in 2026. So how do you think about Bitcoin's cycle? And do you think the Bitcoin treasury companies like Strategy are going to help prolong that cycle? How do you think about it, Yves?
So I mean, I'm looking a bit at the macro landscape, and I've heard some pretty interesting. I'm consuming a lot of different types of content on the either macro side of Bitcoin or Bitcoin treasuries, and they all seem to point to the same direction, that the cycle will be lengthening this time around, and most likely it's because of exactly the macro environment and the liquidity cycle that has now lengthened from 4 to approximately 5 or 6 years. But I think also the institutional players coming in, like Strategy and the other Bitcoin treasuries, are providing also additional support for this thesis. Yeah, when you look at what's going on just in terms of adoption in general and the trends, I think it's hard to say that we've hit a top already. When liquidity is coming in, you have all these bullish signs pointing to, again, a lengthening cycle. We just saw right now the new PM in Japan being elected, which is going to bring again some stimulus to Japan, and we saw the Nikkei like rip like 5% overnight. So all of these are just signs that the market is sniffing out that there's still a lot of room to run.
Yeah, I think you're really right on that, and it seems like around the globe, all the markets are bracing for more and more. And like I said, I've talked with people who advise wealth clients, and they say there's still a lot of capital on the sidelines, which is really interesting. So I mean, that alone, if that comes into the market, is gonna really pump the gas. So yeah, recently with Strive, that's ticker ASST here in the United States, we saw those guys. They've finally closed their reverse merger with asset entities and went public. I really like those guys. Matt Cole, I think, is a great CEO, and I think he's built a great team and board around him. Shortly after they went public, we heard that they were acquiring Semler Scientific, who owns nearly 6,000 Bitcoin, and they're acquiring them in a stock for stock transaction. How did you perceive that news, Eve? And do you think we're going to see more merger and acquisition activity in the Bitcoin space? Because Semler was trading at a discount. Companies that do trade below an mNAV of 1 are going to be primed to merge with these companies, because obviously for Strive, that was an accretive transaction for them. Yeah, what do you think?
So first of all, I was quite surprised because that was quite quick after the post merger deal, right? So I like the movement, the fact that they're moving quickly. That's definitely great. As you mentioned, I like the guys at Strive as well. I think they've built also a really strong team when you look at their board and everything. So I truly believe that they understand the playbook and the strategy. At first, I was a little bit confused, to be honest, about the merger. I didn't expect it. However, in retrospect, I see that there was a lot of synergies to be gained from this. So I think, and there's a little bit of speculation on my end here, just to be clear. I think Semler was in a good path until they had some limitations with their mNAV, and they couldn't acquire as much Bitcoin as they wanted to. And when they wanted to switch their strategy, they also had a proposal in their shareholder meeting now back in September to have those preferred equities, same as strategy, right? And that actually didn't approve. So to me, it kind of signaled that there was still a misalignment with some of the shareholders on the Semler side. And now with obviously trading with their mNAV below 1, maybe they had a little bit of issues to get this strategy going. With Strive coming in and probably with the unconference going on in New York, there was some discussions and they saw that it would be beneficial for both the companies to have a merger where now you could potentially have the shareholders that weren't aligned on the Bitcoin Treasury from the Semler side and be bought out basically. And obviously at a cost for the remaining shareholders that would stay, because it was, in their case, it wasn't accretive, right? It was dilutive. And on the Strive side, it was accretive for their shareholders. That being said, they still had this premium. So the deal was one Semler share was to 21 Strive shares. And that was at around 210% premium, which might seem very expensive. However, I still believe that there is the unlock from the pipe on the Strive side that is still, that needs to happen. And we've seen also with the recent companies that had their unlocked happen, let's take Nakamoto, for example, we unfortunately saw their price completely tumble. So I think this kind of takes into consideration also the pipe unlocked that will happen, I believe, now this month in October. So yeah, that's how I perceive it. I think it's a great thing for the playbook, because now we now get to see the first merger between two Bitcoin treasuries, and we get to see how the market reacts to it, right? I do believe we will see a lot more consolidation, considering that we just had or we're having a bear market on the Bitcoin treasury side, where a lot of companies are trading below mNAV. So it's going to be very easy for bigger players to scoop them up at a discount and make it accretive for the shareholders to buy these companies at a discount.
Yeah, agreed completely. Let me bring up actually a couple price charts on Strive and Semler here. Bear with me. All right, can you see that on your end, Yves?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so Strive's trading at 262, and you talked about the pipe being unlocked. So those pipe investors, for our listeners who may not know, that's a private investment in public equity. So these Strive sought investment before they did the merger to raise funds to buy their initial Bitcoin, which they now have some 5,000 Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and they raised those funds at $1.35 per share. So as those funds unlock, I'm sure a lot of those pipe investors were Bitcoiners, but there's also probably a lot of opportunists who are just looking to, basically arbitrage. They may have been shorting the stock. The options market on ASST on Strive is pretty small. There's some pretty big bid-ask spreads on some of the prices. They don't have weekly expirations, last I checked, and so they can only do so much hedging in the options market. So on October 17th, we're recording this on October 6th. So 11 days from now, you've got these puts that are trading $3.50. So that tells me right there, these $5 puts on ASST for 11 days out, trading at $3.50. That's kind of a $1.50 implied share price in just 11 days. Yet you've got Strive trading at 262. So that's a lot of downside potential if you're a Strive shareholder today. And then of course you mentioned that Semler has a conversion of 21 shares of Strive for each Semler share, and that's trading at $32. So I mean, the market there is saying that either this merger is not going to happen, or the markets think that Strive is headed lower. So when you take a look at that 135 price that the pipe investors came in at for Strive, that implies a $28 share price for Semler. So there may even be some downside there depending on when the merger actually happens. Do you think that merger is going to happen, Yves? Do you have an instinct about whether or not we actually see that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. You're 100% correct, I think. Yeah, I believe that it will happen because of the team that you have behind, right? The board members on the Strive side, but also I think on the Semler side. And I think it's also beneficial to both parties at the end of the day, even though that it might make some of the shareholders suffer some short-term loss. And one aspect also that caught my eye today was Ben Verkman also joining now as a CIO. I thought that was interesting. I still need to wrap my head around that one, but I believe they're really getting their team focused for this accretion. So a botched acquisition or merger to begin with would not look well. So I'm pretty sure they'll make it, whatever it takes, they're going to make it through the finish line.
Yeah, I think I agree on that. They're definitely going to pull out all the stops for that. And, I kind of see this acquisition, and Matt Cole has kind of said that they're doing this to rapidly increase the amount of Bitcoin they're holding on their balance sheet because they're trying to issue preferred equities by the end of this calendar year. That gives them a few months. And I think you just have more legitimacy the more Bitcoin you've got on your balance sheet. If they can complete this merger, swiftly, they're going to be in the top, 10 companies globally on Bitcoin on their balance sheet or pretty near there. So I think that's really important to start attracting that capital. I think the team is really well connected. Matt Cole, their CEO, has a fixed income background. So I'm sure he's going to be really trying to tap his contacts. He worked for the California State Pension, which is the largest or second largest public pension in the United States. So, if he can raise a few $100 million there, that'll go a long way into kind of starting the Bitcoin flywheel, as we say, for Strive. I think there's been a little bit of, with all these companies, you touched on Nakamoto as well. I think there was a little bit of a disconnect between retail shareholders or Bitcoiners who are just kind of starting to wrap their heads around Bitcoin treasury companies. How do you think the communication has been from these smaller Bitcoin treasury companies in letting shareholders know that there could be some price compression?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that the communication or the full transparency was there in terms of these pipe deals that happened. I mean, looking at what happened again with Nakamoto, but then there was also Sequence. At least looking at my Twitter feed or my X feed, it's clear that the communication wasn't complete. I spent quite a lot of time looking at all of this. And in retrospect, looking at the communications of the Sequence and Nakamoto and now Strive with these pipe deals, I think they could have done a better job because, at least to me, it wasn't that obvious at that moment. For me, or someone that spent so much time already looking into it and it wasn't so obvious, I'm afraid it wasn't for the general retail investor, right? So for the sophisticated investors, it might have been a no-brainer. But for the retail, I do believe more transparency is necessary. And that's where Saylor has done an amazing job, right? And I think MetaPlanet as well with Simon and Dylan. They communicate, or they try to communicate the best they can. So that's definitely something that in retrospect could have been done better.
I really think these Bitcoin treasury companies are kind of changing the game as far as communication goes. Like you said, there was, I think, a lot to be desired around these, mergers or reverse mergers for these newer treasury companies. But I think overall, what we've seen with MetaPlanet, what we've seen with a strategy, and what I expect going forward with a lot of these companies is that there's just more investor relations. The CEO is extremely engaged in investor relations, and you don't always see that with a lot of public companies. So obviously, you've watched Strategy's earnings calls, and those are a masterclass in how you should be talking to your investors. They're not boring. I remember being on calls, 7-8 years ago for some small company, and it was just the most boring thing ever. I'd ask a question and not really get much of a response. But Saylor is so comprehensive. He views it as his job to really just communicate exactly what his company's doing, and the transparency is off the charts. A lot of people kind of say that Saylor and Strategy have kind of won the Bitcoin treasury game, and everyone else is kind of fighting for scraps. But because we've seen, Strategy trading a little bit sideways this past year, do you think there's been a bit of a dilution from investors they're investing in these other treasury companies and that's held Strategy's stock price back?
That's a great question. I'm gonna go on a limb and say a little bit, especially on the retail side, I think. Because I think retail saw there were other opportunities in other smaller Bitcoin treasuries. But if you start looking at the bigger bulk of the hedge funds or the real big investors, I think they're still looking at Strategy because of the way that they have done it and their proven track record, and probably also like again because of their charters that they have, they might not be able to allocate capital to smaller companies as well. So I suspect that there was a bit of dilution, but mostly from the retail investor. Let's see if probably the next big ones, like if Strive starts getting really big, then there might be some additional dilution from those big investors as well, right? So they might allocate some of their MSTR shares and exchange them for some Strive shares.
So, what do you think the next big catalyst is for the Bitcoin treasury trade? Do you think it was just kind of a lull in the summer? We hit a little bit of retail exhaustion with investors, or obviously if Bitcoin's price rips, that should really affect investor interest in these treasury companies. But do you think it needs a catalyst other than that, Yves?
It's also a great question. So I think definitely a Bitcoin price rip would benefit all Bitcoin treasuries in general. I think especially if we start seeing those bigger moves on the Bitcoin side, because we're still seeing a little bit of those sidestep moves with Bitcoin, and it might appear a little bit boring to some of the, especially I guess the retail investors. But if it starts doing what it did in 2017, where it starts going parabolic, then there's going to be some, again, a bit of euphoria going on. And obviously that's going to definitely boost the Bitcoin treasuries on top of it. And let's see what happens, because now if Bitcoin treasuries starts also gaining some synergy, then it's all reflexive. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the new products also react to the Bitcoin price move. Because if you have now STRC that's on par at around 100, then Strategy is not even needing to really use all of their other instruments behind it. So that's one thing. And then probably you have also all the preferreds that also start reaping. So it's really hard to tell, because now we have a different landscape than what we had 1 year ago without those preferreds. That's going to be, at least for me, I'm gonna probably have a few sleepless nights just trying to figure out what's going on everywhere. But really looking forward to when that happens. Yeah.
I know that's very relatable. It's so hard to keep up with all the news in this space, but I love it. It'll be interesting to see too once more preferreds get rolled out. They're not going to perform just like Strategy, I don't think, from the get-go. Just like some of the equities haven't been performing like strategies. Everyone's kind of a couple of years behind Michael Saylor. Do you have a sense for, other than Strategy, who's your company that you're looking at in the Bitcoin treasury space that you have the highest conviction about?
I have to go with MetaPlanet because of their track record, the way that they've done it. As we mentioned before, the communication, in my opinion, has been great. Also, the way that they've done it, right? Because obviously you have those big entrants, again, Strive coming in right off the bat with the merger, 11,000 Bitcoin, or you have the 21 Capital that hasn't even started doing anything, that has like 40,000 Bitcoin or more. MetaPlanet has been from the get-go like doing what they do, but quite meticulously, and the accretion and the Bitcoin yield, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm looking at, is the Bitcoin per share and the Bitcoin yield. That's what matters the most to me. And these metrics that they've had put out are just great. I think there's two other competitors that are getting close and that have followed to some extent a mix maybe of MetaPlanet and some other combinations, and that's Smarter Web, the company, and the Capital B, because they come more from a retail focused or a grassroots movement where they started very small, accumulating a few Bitcoins here and there, and now they're growing quite intensively over the last few months. Obviously now there's a slowdown, but they have room to keep growing, because the way that they've done it, similar to MetaPlanet, without too much leverage, or a very smart leverage like Capital B with their Bitcoin denominated convertibles, which again, it's been a while, but I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around those. And those are very important instruments or capacities that they will be able to enable once we hit another bear market or during this bear market itself. So probably those contenders more than the bigger players, because again, strategy, because of the way that they've done it, I feel like they've won a little bit this market, especially in the US. So if you start looking a little bit abroad, then I think MetaPlanet or somewhere in a different capital market, that could be also interesting.
I think you're right. MetaPlanet has certainly really established themselves as a force, in the Bitcoin Treasury space. I'm interested to see how a lot of these new players are going to perform over the next coming months. You mentioned how these guys might perform in a Bitcoin bear market. What is your take, Yves, on what a company should do if Bitcoin's price is down, or if their company is trading at a discount to their Bitcoin on the balance sheet?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few instruments that they have in their toolkit, and again, also that depends on the leverage that they have already on the balance sheet. Because if a company is already quite levered to some extent, and I mean, it doesn't need to be 50%, but again, depends on the situation, then they might have less tools because they need to defend this mNAV. In a case where a Bitcoin treasury is not levered, let's take a MetaPlanet, they could potentially just issue some leverage to buy back some shares, which would be accretive to the shareholders at the end of the day. And so that's definitely one toolkit in case you're not leveraged. The other one is actually, to be honest, just look for a buyer. I'm sure there's some Bitcoin treasuries that would be happy to scoop you up. Maybe, as we've seen, probably not even at a discount, but if they see some synergies, there could be a premium and you can still sell the company. Probably a lot of the management or the leadership of the company might not be willing to do it because obviously it's your baby and it might be a bit hard, but could be very beneficial to the shareholders. So that's probably another aspect. And the last one, or actually before the last one, they're still also selling some derivatives on your Bitcoin that you already have, right? I think Saylor mentioned that could be probably not the last resort, but just before the last resort, a kind of tool that you can use. And the last one, but this one, I think if that happens, that you have to sell your Bitcoin, then you're in really big trouble because I think the trust erodes, and I'm not even sure that you can come back from that. So that one, I know there's still debates about it, and I guess we'll see it eventually in a bear market. But this one, I do not trust is the right path.
Yeah, I agree with you. The whole point is to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, and as soon as you give that up by selling Bitcoin, I think, yeah, it could have really negative effects on investor sentiment. I was interested to hear a lot of people say that they should do that, and I understand the mechanics of how technically it's accretive, but that kind of goes against the whole strategy, if you will.
Exactly.
And before we wrap here, do you think we see Michael Saylor take a look at the acquisition strategy for some of these distressed companies? It seems Strive has an appetite, obviously, to do these mergers. It seems like Nakamoto will be open to that type of thing. It seems like Jack Maller's company 21 is probably going to be open to that sort of thing. But I haven't heard Saylor really talk about it, and I'm curious your take on whether or not you think he might dip his toe in that water.
I think Saylor has mentioned that he's not looking for any acquisitions or mergers, and because he wants to have his company as transparent and as easy to understand for the shareholders. So whenever you bring in some acquisition or merger, then obviously you need to understand what's happening behind. And again, if we look at the Strive Semler, there's still some question marks around that, right? So it's not all straightforward. And even if a company is, let's say, has an mNAV that is very low, let's say, I don't know, zero 0.5 or with a crazy discount, I think that seller would not take it because of the complications that it brings to the deal, in the sense that shareholders now have to evaluate what's happening with this acquisition and this merger, and they need to understand, okay, what's being acquired. Even if there's Bitcoin, there's probably also some business that comes with it. What happens to this business? And any acquisition merger has some risks, and I think a seller does not want to bring those risks into strategy based on of what I've heard from his talks. And I think that's also one of the reasons that I like being a shareholder of strategy, because for me, it's very straightforward. I know what I'm getting for. I don't have any surprises that come my way. Even if it's positive surprises, there's no surprises in that sense. So I don't believe that he will go for an acquisition merger, at least not in the short term.
Thanks so much, Yves, for joining us. Can you tell our viewers where to find you and your podcast?
Yeah, sure. So we're on YouTube and on X at OneSharePod. And you can also find me at Graf Yves on X. I'm quite active, so feel free to reach out. And anytime, any question, just reach out.
Awesome. One thing we have our guests say before they leave, as you know, is stay orange.
Stay orange.
Ladies and gentlemen, the man who's all in on the chair, Yves-Andre Graf.